All About Beer receives underwriting support from Bright Ideas. They understand the importance of independent journalism in the beer space, and their support helps fund original work. Learn how you can affordably support journalists by visiting allaboutbeer.com/support.
Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Holl. The writer Tom Acitelli is here to talk about his new book that goes deep into styles, history, some trivia, and the evolution of beer. It's the kind of educational inspiration we can all use at the start of a new year. And before we get into it, I hope you'll consider supporting All About Beer. There's a number of ways you can do it, through our Patreon, through our underwriting, and through our advertising. The only way that we can continue to bring you original shows like this, or the All About Beer podcast, or Brewer to Brewer, and articles on our site is through your support. Please go visit allaboutbeer.com/support to learn more. And thanks to this episode's sponsors.
Attention brewers. Registration is now open for the 2025 Best of Craft Beer Awards. This is a BJCP sanctioned competition judged by fellow brewers and industry leaders. It uses a unique set of style guidelines that champions harmonious and dynamic beers. Held in beautiful Central Oregon, it's the third largest professional brewing competition in North America and is an opportunity to have your hard work evaluated and rewarded. In addition to traditional and specialty beer styles, new this year is the hop water category. Register your beers through January 31, 2025 by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register. Don't delay. Learn more and get your beers signed up by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register.
Today's episode is sponsored by Stomp Stickers. Stomp is a proud member of the Brewers Association that produces a wide variety of printed brewery products, such as beer labels, keg collars, coasters, beer boxes, and much more. Stomp's website features an easy-to-use digital design tool, low-quantity orders, fast turnaround times, and free domestic shipping. Visit stompstickers.com and use code BREWER for 15% off of your first order. A reminder, you can go to allaboutbeer.com for original articles. There's also some reviews, news, insights, and our podcasts. Listen to shows like Brewer to Brewer and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. And no joke, there's a whole bunch of really good ones coming up. Follow All About Beer on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, Blue Sky, at All About Beer. And as always, you can keep up with all of our smoked beer news and releases by checking out This Week in Rauch Beer by searching the group on Facebook or follow at TW Rauch Beer on Threads and Instagram. As Facebook as well, yeah. Glassware and apparel is available at allaboutbeer.com/merch. And again, you can go visit allaboutbeer.com/support because a few bucks goes a long way to fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. One of those writers is Tom Acitelli. He was a guy that I've known for years. He is a great journalist and beer historian who spends time doing research that eventually bubbles up into interesting stories. He was a longtime columnist for All About Beer and is the author of several books, including The Audacity of Hops, The History of America's Craft Beer Revolution, and Pilsner, How the Beer of Kings Changed the World. And in 2020, the North American Guild of Beer Writers voted that the best book out there. His latest book is called The Golden Age of Beer, a 52-week guide to the perfect beer for every week of the year. It is, as the press material that came with my advance copy says, quote, full of Acitelli's inviting, accessible voice and dives into homebrewing, beer icons, today's industry game changers, and more. It cuts through the noise and the hype to leave you with a lush, inspiring, reliable guide for sampling and entertaining all year long. And after reading the book, I find no fault at all with that statement. Tom joined me from Boston. Here's our conversation. Hey, Tom, Happy New Year. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, John. Happy New Year.
I want to start off right with the title of the new book and kind of challenge you just a little bit. What in your mind makes this the golden age when it comes to beer?
There is more selection on the shelves and along the taps than there ever has been before. Regardless of what's happening in the industry, and the turnover and the churn that's been affecting brewing since at least 2020, there is still this kaleidoscope of styles that would have been unimaginable even 15, 20 years ago, and certainly 30 or 40 years ago. And so that's why I went with the title, The Golden Age of Beer, to try to reiterate and to remind people who might have forgotten, because of that churn in the industry, the consumer choice that is out there. And the book strives to make sense of that choice for beer buyers and drinkers.
All right. So it's the making sense part of it that I still struggle with, even with this day job of mine, because there is so much choice out there, and I was on a kick for a while where I was going around and just saying styles are meaningless because nobody was paying attention to them, and then brewers would create, air quotes, create a new style. And have some thoughts on what it should be, and then another brewer would hear about it, and it was like a bad game of telephone. I'm thinking specifically of Brut IPA, and it never had a chance to take off because consumers didn't know what to look for. And I think that that's even playing out right now with IPA, where if I walk into a brewery and I see a list of IPA, I now know that it's probably going to be haze and not West Coast that I came up on, and with a nice bitterness and clear and everything. But for newer drinkers, younger drinkers, that's not the case. So when you're doing a style book in 2025, 2024, what were the big challenges? Like, there's obviously BJCP and other things that beer judges use, but that's not always translatable to the general drinking public.
Absolutely. And that raises a very good point, John. I did use the BJCP and Cicerone guidelines as sort of my guide. I used, the tasting guidelines that the Great American Beer Festival and other festivals would use. I didn't want to go completely out there on a limb, but I wanted to use the book to make sense of what's out there, right? To meld it with the history and the experimentation that happens and that has happened and that you alluded to, that creates these quote unquote styles in some cases. I mean, it is very difficult sometimes to delineate what makes a certain style. I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is there is this tradition of experimentation in American brewing that goes back a long time, even before craft beer, right? Where the sort of melting pot of different populations in the United States devising and making beer and marketing it. It was inevitable that it wouldn't be this sort of localized phenomenon. You had different experiences and different ideas, pardon the pun, pouring into different styles. And so what was created in the United States, even if it was based off of, say, European styles, was inevitably, I think, going to be different. The other thing is just a simple legal parameters. Wine, if a varietal is going to, if a bottle of wine is going to call itself a certain type of wine, a certain varietal like Merlot or Pinot Noir, it has to be made with a certain share of the grapes being that varietal, right? Bourbon is very strictly regulated if it's going to call itself a bourbon. This is not the case with beer. And so the styles are largely up to the marketplace and to the individual breweries. So you combine this history, this cultural history, and the lack of legal guardrails when it comes to styles, and people can go crazy. The IPA is probably the best example. It does not taste like an IPA would have tasted in the UK, in the late 19th century. The IPAs in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's very subjective. And so what I seek to do here is to meld the history of styles and brewing with the styles that we have, quote unquote, styles that we have available today. And it's funny you mentioned, was it Brut IPA?
Yeah.
One of the sidebars I have in the book is, fads, like how some attempts at styles don't take. And one of the examples I used was, glitter beer, right? That, a few years ago was kind of a mini phenomenon in the industry and in the marketplace. And it's interesting because if you go back to the mid 1990s, Miller Clear was introduced with a lot of fanfare by Miller Brewing then.
Okay.
And it was supposed to be this sort of sparkly, bubbly, clear beer. And the great beer critic Michael Jackson, writing in a UK newspaper, compared Miller Clear to a lager the color of 7-Up, which formed little head and tasted like a sweetened seltzer. So this was in 1994, right? And so
is this a precursor to Zima?
Yeah, this was around the same time as Zima, but it was meant to be a beer. It was a clear, glittery, translucent beer, and it sort of foreshadowed Brut. It foreshadowed glitter beer. It foreshadowed hard seltzer. So in other words, that you can place the historical context of some of these emerging styles quite earlier than when they came out.
Okay. So, God, there's a lot to unpack now. When you were doing your research, when you were committing to putting these styles down on paper,
mm-hmm.
and you sort of mentioned IPA back in the day and everything, but was there a way to sort of track the evolution of how beer styles have evolved over time?
That's a very good question. Yeah. Yes, there is, but even that is subjective, I think. In the case of IPA, for your listeners under 35, and it's probably inconceivable, but
we don't have listeners under 35. That's this is the old man podcast.
All right. But I'm just saying that they can't imagine a world without IPA and without IPA being defined as bitter, like really bitter, but it was fading from the marketplace. Garrett Oliver, the great brewmaster of Brooklyn, I forget when it was. It was a while ago, like 20 years ago, where he was quoted as saying, IPA was something, that you would hear from British brewers, like, talking wistfully about the style. And then it got in the hands of the craft brewers in the United States and evolved into what we know today. So again, you can use history to mark the evolution of these styles, but the styles themselves and what defines them is subjective. It's creating, the brewers and their companies create the history, right, as they make the styles. I think it's a very interesting thing. And we've seen it, in real time in the last several years with New England IPA, with Mexican lager, with India Pale Ale, these styles that were not even that well known and maybe, arguably could say did not really exist, were created. And then you go back and you say, well, what created them and who created them and what are the major milestones? It's almost like you work backwards to define it rather than forward.
I like that. Talk to me about Michael Jackson. I never met the man. He passed away in 2007. I was writing about beer at the time, but our paths never crossed because I wasn't at that level. But you've spent a lot of time chronicling him and looking into his background. And I don't know if there is a beer critic, journalist personality that wasn't a brewer, that looms quite as large as him, even now, coming up on 20 years since his death. For those under 35, they might not know him. For those over, they certainly do. And his presence, I think, is still felt in a lot of circles. But you spend a lot of time talking about him in this book, and I guess I want to know why and what we can learn from his enduring legacy.
Right. Michael, I never met him either. Great regret, but single most important figure in beer style and in modern times. And why is that? Because he basically invented the parameters for thinking about style. Before Jackson came along in the 1970s, writing in the UK, style was put into things like there was no such thing as style, but those who were writing about beer, if they were writing about beer at all, and there weren't many people writing about beer in any serious way in the 1970s because of what beer had become in much of the world.
Yeah, like bland, like one
Yeah,
note. Yeah.
exactly. People wrote about style in terms of categories, even things like species, type. He wrote about style in terms of defining it as the brewers saw it and putting it in a place, right? Of defining it to where it was born, where a kind of beer was born and developed, and who made it so and what made it so. So he gave birth to the idea of beer style, and he did it pretty much single-handedly. So I used Jackson as my kind of muse for this book of thinking in terms of how he thought about beer and beer style. And one of the striking things is that nobody thought of it like that until that point. And since then, how as Americans especially, I don't want to sound like all jingoistic and but Americans in particular embrace the idea of we're going to make beer of a certain type, of a certain kind, based on these parameters that this Brit put down. And the Americans really ran away with it in a way people in other countries only caught up to in the last 30 years or so. So Michael Jackson invented beer style, invented the way we talk about beer, invented the way even I don't want to go too far, but even the way we sort of think taste beer when we drink it, the way to taste it. He gave it a kind of a veneer that wine at the time enjoyed. He did it for beer.
Do you feel like some of that's been lost?
Oh yeah. I think part of that is the fault of the culture in the industry. I mean, not the industry. I wouldn't blame the industry as much. I'd blame people like myself, like who it almost becomes like a parody. There was a Super Bowl commercial about 10 years ago mocking the pretensions of the craft beer world.
Oh gosh, what was that? Bud Heavy, and what was it? We don't need pumpkin peach something or other, and they had just bought Elysian, which had a pumpkin peach, which was hysterical.
Oh yeah, that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Apparently, the two sides of the company weren't talking, but yeah, the guy had the handlebar.
See, again, we're two guys over 35 now. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I think that the genuine appreciation for what makes a style and what defines it, and does this particular beer hit the marks? Does this particular brewery hit the marks? Is kind of lost. I think part of that is because people don't understand where style comes from or what defines certain styles. I think you've mentioned on the show, hop burn juice, like some of the IPAs that are coming out, some of the double IPAs and New England IPAs are just sort of leaning into hops and bitterness. And is there any balance? And is this really what we talk about or have talked about when we talk about IPA? And that's a genuine debate to be had. The knowledge, I don't want to come off highfalutin or snobbish, but the knowledge isn't there sometimes. And I think it's because a lot of people got turned off to learning about it. And it's a fascinating thing to dive into. It's a fascinating culture to dive into. The science of it is really amazing. The people behind it continue to be amazing. And I think people should get into it more. And the knowledge breeds an appreciation.
I wonder, though, when it comes to styles, right? And this is where I struggled back in the day when I was saying styles don't matter anymore, because with all of the new ingredients that are out there, with going through a hop catalog, going through a malt catalog, even strains of yeast that are throwing off various phenolics and esters, right? Mm-hmm. There's back in the day when Jackson started doing it, it was going to be fairly easy. Not easy, but to say, okay, an IPA has these 5 hops available to them, these 3 malts, this one yeast strain, and we can build out from there. But now I mean, no two IPAs are alike. Rarely. I mean, there's a lot of Citra Mosaic, but it's, it's changed the game, especially with, when we went through the IBU wars, and then we had, just how many pounds per barrel could we shove into a beer just for the shock
Right.
value and the overall waste. And then we don't even, that's before we're even scratching the surface of, adjuncts that are going into things these days, from, Swedish fish to marshmallows to, yeast from the belly of wasps, right? So it strikes me as it's harder to do now, and to communicate that to a general drinking public who walk in, who just have an idea of an IPA being juicy, probably tropical with a little bit of sweetness but no bitterness, and not really caring about Eldorado or Sabro or whatever else goes in, flaked oats. And even bartenders don't have, or brewers don't
Yep.
have that time, that kind of time to hand walk everybody through. This is what you're tasting. This is what you're doing.
Right, right. I do think, though, that's where the sort of pursuit of the knowledge can enhance the experience. And I think that's one of the things that will help the industry through this rough time, is to get back to that basic of educating people and of drawing people in to their tap rooms and their brewery tours, and even their online presence, of learning what goes into these different beers, right? Because the cost is at a premium for the consumer. The materials and supplies, they cost more for the brewer. So it behooves both sides of the deals, so to speak, to spend more time learning about what goes into these beers and these beer styles. But I would come back to, the fact that, it's all gotten so elastic and it's all gotten sort of out of control. But you can still go back to the history, and you can look at, what Jackson did and what other writers did early on, of defining, styles, considering how, a brewer makes the beer, how long the brewer typically takes to make the beer, and what ingredients the brewer puts into it. That can define the style at its root. And then, then it just sort of takes off in its own direction. But you can, by looking at the history, you can get back to the root of the style and a definition of it. And also, I want to, pick up on what you're saying. There's also been the perennial debate now about what defines craft beer and craft brewing, and that sort of fits into it too. Has largely gone out the window. The conventional, the old school styles of defining it have went away about 15 years ago, and it's that's an ongoing debate as well. History is not as much of a help in that regard, but when it comes to styles, I think it really is. And I think it helps to know the history, and it can help you appreciate the style in the here and now.
Yeah. No, I like that.
I do worry. So I just want to pick. I do worry
go ahead.
that we're going to start spinning off into anything becomes a style. Almost just made up. But that's always been a facet of craft beer in particular, and that I forget the exact year it happened, but Tony McGee of Lagunitas, was on a early AOL chat room discussion, or not AOL, it was some sort of very early internet, where you could go back and forth with a group of people, and he was on, and somebody asked him to explain a particular style, and he wasn't too keen on staying in his lane when it came to styles, which turned out to pay off very well for him. But he said, "Oh, it's an Uzbeki Raga style ale or something," and that set people off to
What did he call it?
It was some sort of, it was a question from a home brewers group in the Northwest, and they wanted to know what type of style. This is way too bitter to be an IPA or something like that. It was one of their earliest Lagunitas beers, right?
Sure.
So I'm guessing it was an ale, and I'm guessing it was on the hoppier side. and he described it as just sort of a joke, like Uzbeki Raga style, something or another. And
Okay.
people lost their, they went nuts, and how dare you do that? But my point is that this was back in the 90s, and that sort of debate over made up styles and sort of elasticity of styles and taking it as a joke, has always been there. But interestingly enough, it all comes back. Things tend to go back to the mean, and people do tend to discuss styles under certain parameters.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. And I think even with beer judging, you can still kind of get a decent sense of what's out there and what, cream rises to the top, right? And there's typically good examples for each of these styles. Regardless of, the gimmickry behind it. I want to talk a little bit just about the book itself. And you start in December, and you offer 4 beer styles per month that people should learn about and then drink during that month. And you give the various reasons why. And I want to give you a little bit of shit because we're in January for cream ale in January. And I know why you do it for the Gottfried Kruger Brewery of Newark in the great state of New Jersey. National Beer Can Day. Cream ale in January is not something that I think about drinking in January. But I like the historicalness behind it. But when you're thinking about some of these other styles, right? Cream ale aside, because I'll fight you on that. But how did you come up with, okay, I'm going to put these beers in this month, right? Because you're always going to have assholes like me who are going to argue with you, just either one for the sake of argument or, 2 because I'm right and you're wrong. But how did you come up with, okay, I'm going to put triple in December. I'm going to put, barley wine in January, marches for brown ale, that kind of thing.
That's a fantastic question. I honestly, part of it was Jackson. He wrote over time, every style under the sun. Well, actually not. There's some that he missed, but they were barely, they weren't really on the popular radar or even the industry radar by the time he passed. But part of it was him saying certain beers are for certain seasons of the year. And part of it was just my preference. So, and what I think, a lot of people would agree with. So for instance, the heavier beer styles are in the winter months, the warming, the richer brews, the thinner, more refreshing, crisper beers are for the warmer months, the summer and spring. And, fall was more difficult, but I could lean on, there's a lot of tradition in the fall, Marzen beer, the Oktoberfest. And then the sort of tertiary reason was there would be historical events. And so I'd want to meld with the history again and put, attach a style to a major turning point in that style's evolution. So that's where the sort of by the month came from, and what certain beers in certain weeks. And it also helped me just to think about beer. You go to a store now, you go to a great, good bar. I'm up in the Boston area. There's many. They have everything all year round, basically, except there are seasonal releases. You won't get like an Oktoberfest and well, I was about to say in August, but you probably will. But like in June.
As we head into January, I was getting emails over break of, hey, we have our pumpkin beer on clearance, and
you have this wide variety, so you think it's always it's always available, and it's not. And Jackson was one of the first people to just remind people it's a seasonal agricultural product that was very much tied to the land and tied to festivals and religious festivals and state festivals and celebrations. And that thinking about it that way helped me organize the book over the year. And I think that's really a great way to think about beer in general, to place it in its geographic and historical context, and it helps you enjoy it more. And then and it helps you realize what some of these smaller brewers are trying to do in keeping some of these styles and approaches alive. I'm thinking of a lot of the growth in lager production in the craft sphere. That's still seems new to a lot of people. That is a result of looking back at the history of brewing in the United States and brewing throughout its history. So
I like that. And I do like the historical context of it. Cream ale for me has always been what I drink the 4th of July. I get a 30 pack, a Jenny Cream, and you're not saying you can only drink these beers during those months, but I like that seasonality behind it as well, and that you're also kind of throwing new ways of thinking about some of these styles your way as well.
And cream ale, I'm sorry, just almost positive. Now, I've been working on this book for years. So this went back to the early days of the pandemic, the idea for it and then the work. But I'm almost positive Michael Jackson did not write about cream ale. I could be wrong.
Huh.
There are a couple styles that sort of eluded him, even though they had been out there for a while. But cream ale was sort of a distinctly American invention, so it's entirely possible that he missed it. At least I wish I knew it offhand, but he definitely, wrote about steam beer and California Common.
Oh yeah.
He missed Kentucky Common, but that's I don't want to open up that debate whether it's distinct or not. But
why? Let's open it up. Is it distinct or not?
It is. It's distinct to me for the purposes of this book, but it's one of those. It's one of those things where you can reach back to the history and say this was the time and place when this was developed. This is the parameter, right? And this is how people at the time would have understood this style, right? But the way it's made now, Kentucky Common, probably does not match what happened before entirely. But there's still enough of the history, and there's still enough of the original approach to define it, right? I also think something like Mexican lager, there has been lager brewing in what's now Mexico for a long, long, long time. The style itself was defined and developed in the United States, though, often by brewers of Mexican descent, but it sort of came into its own north of the border. That's another interesting thing. Like it has its originality and it has its parameters at its root, but then it develops in the hands of the brewers beyond that, right? So I find that, I find stuff like that interesting, the evolution of it rooted in the history of it. So
I like that. Yeah, and the history that you weave in on this is so critically important, and it is something that I feel is lacking these days. It's like the old IPA debate of, they put it on ships, that, and those bad rumors get repeated and everything. But having somebody who cares about history and who dives deep into the to the topic that, like you do, is so necessary and so important for a book like this. And I'll point out that Kentucky Common should be consumed during the month of May, along with Maibach, a mild, and a Pilsner. Which again, I'm not going to argue with any of those. Were there styles that you wanted to include that you just didn't have the word count book
That's
length for?
Good question. No, not really. I put it all in there and put it all out there. I would have liked to actually go into more of the controversy surrounding some of these styles, like IPA and Mexican lager, IPL, which is a very young style, and it's not entirely. There's debate over its origins and whether how distinct it really is. So I would have liked to have gone more into that. But that's one of the reasons you dive into the history and you learn the context, because it does it. I've been doing this for a while, and it made me appreciate the effort that goes into the creation of these beers. It made me appreciate the nuances and the tastes and the tastings. And it made me understand, this is it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing thing. And like I said, the the idea for the book started in the early days of the pandemic, right? Sort of making sense of the marketplace as it was becoming and as it was. And then, things kept changing in the last few years. Oftentimes, from the industry's perspective, for the worst. For the consumer, though, I think the variety is still out there. The kaleidoscope of choice and style is still out there. So it sort of drove me to, strive to make sense of it, to sort of walk people through why we even debate these styles, right? Why they're even worthy for the debate, and give people sort of the ammunition to debate them, and to refute some of the legend that's out there, and to bolster some of the the facts and the people behind them. So
Yeah.
who put in the effort and took the financial risk and made these great styles and made these beers and put them out there. So
I like that. So I've been asking folks on the show for, a couple of years now. And I don't believe that you've been asked and or answered this question yet, but I've been asking people the green door question, which is in the television show, The Good Place, there is a green door that the characters walk through, and they can be anywhere doing whatever they want to be doing. And so if we had a green door on our plane of existence, and you could walk through it when this conversation ended and be at any pub or any brewery anywhere in the world, where would you want to go? Who would you want to be with? And what would you like to be drinking?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Many years ago, I went around to all the Trappist breweries in Belgium. I loved West Fletrin, the little cafe that's across the street, I think, from the monastery. I don't know if it's still there. I know they've had trouble. Not them specifically, but the Trappist brewery. So I'd be there.
Okay, just drinking whatever was on offer.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And just any local brewery that makes fantastic beers with a knowledge and an appreciation for the people and the turning points that came before. Beer with a history, beer with context.
Yeah, I like that. All right. Well, I'm going to tell folks that the name of the book is called The Golden Age of Beer, a 52-week guide to the perfect beer for every week of the year. The author is Tom Acitelli. It comes out on February 25th of this year. So it's available now for pre-order, which you all should go out and be doing, and then kick off in the month of February, drinking all of Tom's recommendations. And then it gets you through to 2026, which I think makes a lot of sense. Tom, thanks for writing this. Thanks for doing this. It's good to talk to you. It's good to hear your perspective on things. It's been a while.
John, thank you so much. And thank you for all you're doing. Thank you very much.
You're too kind. Would you like to read more beer history content on allaboutbeer.com? Tell me, or you can share other suggestions for content by emailing me at johnholl@allaboutbeer.com. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com. And as always, I do my best to respond to every email that comes in. The only way that we can keep doing this show, our other shows, and pay writers for original articles is with your help. Please visit allaboutbeer.com/support to learn more. A reminder, go visit allaboutbeer.com, where you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, read great new content, as well as the archives, which go all the way back to 1979. Follow All About Beer on social media at All About Beer. And before we go, here's a word from this week's sponsors.
Attention brewers. Registration is now open for the 2025 Best of Craft Beer Awards. This is a BJCP sanctioned competition judged by fellow brewers and industry leaders. It uses a unique set of style guidelines that champions harmonious and dynamic beers. Held in beautiful Central Oregon, it's the third largest professional brewing competition in North America and is an opportunity to have your hard work evaluated and rewarded. In addition to traditional and specialty beer styles, new this year is the hop water category. Register your beers through January 31, 2025 by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register. Don't delay. Learn more and get your beers signed up by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register.
Today's episode is sponsored by Stomp Stickers. Stomp is a proud member of the Brewers Association that produces a wide variety of printed brewery products, such as beer labels, keg collars, coasters, beer boxes, and much more. Stomp's website features an easy-to-use digital design tool, low-quantity orders, fast turnaround times, and free domestic shipping. Visit stompstickers.com and use code BREWER for 15% off of your first order. Final reminder this week, All About Beer has a podcast channel, so search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday. The BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. And check out probrewer.com each week for original articles from the All About Beer team. As for this show, Nate Schweber does the music, Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Holl. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.